Africa is the world's second largest and second most populous continent, at about 30.3 million square kilometers including adjacent islands. It covers 6% of Earth's total surface area and 20.4% of its total land area. With 1.1 billion people as of 2013, it accounts for about 15% of the world's human population. The continent is surrounded by the Mediterranean Sea to the north, both the Suez Canal and the Red Sea along the Sinai Peninsula to the northeast, the Indian Ocean to the southeast, and the Atlantic Ocean to the west. The continent includes Madagascar and various archipelagos. It contains 54 fully recognized sovereign states, 9 territories and 2 de facto independent states with limited or no recognition. Africa's population is the youngest amongst all the continents. The median age in 2012 was 19.7, when the worldwide median age was 30.4. Algeria is Africa's largest country by area and Nigeria by population. Africa, particularly Central Eastern Africa, is widely accepted as the place of origin of humans and the hominidae clade, as evidenced by the discovery of the earliest hominids and their ancestors, as well as later ones that have been dated to around 7 million years ago, including Sahelanthropus chadensis, Australopithecus africanus, A. afarensis, Homo erectus, H. habilis and H. agaster, with the earliest Homo sapiens found in Ethiopia being dated to circa 200,000 years ago. Africa straddles the equator and encompasses numerous climate areas. It is the only continent to stretch from the northern temperate to southern temperate zones. Africa hosts a large diversity of ethnicities, cultures and languages. In the late 19th century, European countries colonized most of Africa. Most present states in Africa originate from a process of decolonization in the 20th century. Etymology: Afri was a Latin name used to refer to the inhabitants of Africa, which in its widest sense referred to all lands south of the Mediterranean. This name seems to have originally referred to a native Libyan tribe. See Terence #biography for discussion. The name is usually connected with Hebrew or Phoenician afar dust, but a 1981 hypothesis has asserted that it stems from the Berber Ifri cave, in reference to cave dwellers. The same word may be found in the name of the Banu Ifan from Algeria and Tripolitania, a Berber tribe originally from Yafan in northwestern Libya. Under Roman rule, Carthage became the capital of the province of Africa Proconsularized, which also included the coastal part of modern Libya. The Latin suffix "ica" can sometimes be used to denote a land. The later Muslim kingdom of Ifriqiya, modern-day Tunisia, also preserved a form of the name. According to the Romans, Africa lay to the west of Egypt, while Asia was used to refer to Anatolia and lands to the east. A definite line was drawn between the two continents by the geographer Ptolemy, indicating Alexandria along the prime meridian and making the Isthmus of Suez and the Red Sea the boundary between Asia and Africa. As Europeans came to understand the real extent of the continent, the idea of Africa expanded with the knowledge. Other etymological hypotheses have been postulated for the ancient name Africa. The 1st-century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus asserted that it was named for Epha, grandson of Abraham, according to Gen. 25-4, whose descendants, he claimed, had invaded Libya. Isidore of Seville in Etymology I 14.5.2 suggests Africa comes from the Latin aprica, meaning sunny. Massey, in 1881, stated that Africa is derived from the Egyptian afruikar, meaning to turn toward the opening of the car. The car is the energetic double of every person, and the opening of the car refers to a womb, a birthplace. Africa would be, for the Egyptians, the birthplace. Michel Freud proposed linking the Latin word with Africa's south wind, which would be of Umbrian origin and mean originally rainy wind. Robert R. Stieglitz of Rutgers University proposed the name Africa, derived from the Latin asterisk Aphiraisia, is cognate to Hebrew Ophir. History. Prehistory Africa is considered by most paleoanthropologists to be the oldest inhabited territory on Earth, with the human species originating from the continent. During the mid-20th century, anthropologists discovered many fossils and evidence of human occupation perhaps as early as 7 million years ago. Fossil remains of several species of early ape-like humans thought to have evolved into modern man, such as Australopithecus afarensis and Homo ergaster, have been discovered. After the evolution of Homo sapiens approximately 150,000 to 100,000 years BP in Africa, the continent was mainly populated by groups of hunter-gatherers. These first modern humans left Africa and populated the rest of the globe during the Out of Africa II migration dated to approximately 50,000 years BP, exiting the continent either across Bab el-Mandeb over the Red Sea, the Strait of Gibraltar in Morocco, or the Isthmus of Suez in Egypt. Other migrations of modern humans within the African continent have been dated to the time, with evidence of early human settlement found in southern Africa, Southeast Africa, North Africa, and the Sahara. The size of the Sahara has historically been extremely variable, with its area rapidly fluctuating and at times disappearing depending on global climatic conditions. At the end of the Ice Ages, estimated to have been around 10,500 BC, the Sahara had again become a green fertile valley, and its African populations returned from the interior and coastal highlands in sub-Saharan Africa, with rock art paintings depicting a fertile Sahara and large populations discovered in Tasil in Niger dating back perhaps 10 millennia. However, the warming and drying climate meant that by 5000 BC, the Sahara region was becoming increasingly dry and hostile. Around 3500 BC, due to a tilt in the Earth's orbit, the Sahara experienced a period of rapid desertification. The population trekked out of the Sahara region towards the Nile Valley below the Second Cataract, where they made permanent or semi-permanent settlements. A major climatic recession occurred, lessening the heavy and persistent rains in Central and Eastern Africa. Since this time, dry conditions have prevailed in Eastern Africa and, increasingly during the last 200 years, in Ethiopia. The domestication of cattle in Africa preceded agriculture and seems to have existed alongside hunter-gatherer cultures. It is speculated that by 6000 BC, cattle were domesticated in North Africa. In the Sahara-Nile complex, people domesticated many animals, including the donkey and a small screw-horned goat, which was common from Algeria to Nubia. Around 4000 BC, the Saharan climate started to become dry at an exceedingly fast pace. This climate change caused lakes and rivers to shrink significantly and caused increasing desertification. This, in turn, decreased the amount of land conducive to settlements and helped to cause migrations of farming communities to the more tropical climate of West Africa. By the first millennium BC, ironworking had been introduced in northern Africa and quickly spread across the Sahara into the northern parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and by 500 BC, metalworking began to become commonplace in West Africa. Ironworking was fully established by roughly 500 BC in many areas of East and West Africa, although other regions didn't begin ironworking until the early centuries AD. Copper objects from Egypt, North Africa, Nubia, and Ethiopia dating from around 500 BC have been excavated excavated in West Africa, suggesting that trans-Saharan trade networks had been established by this date. Early civilizations at about 3300 BC. The historical record opens in northern Africa with the rise of literacy in the pharaonic civilization of ancient Egypt. One of the world's earliest and longest-lasting civilizations, the Egyptian state continued, with varying levels of influence over other areas, until 343 BC. Egyptian influence reached deep into modern-day Libya and Nubia and, according to Martin Bernal, as far north as Crete, an independent center of civilization with trading links to Phoenicia was established by Phoenicians from Tyre on the northwest African coast. At Carthage, European exploration of Africa began with ancient Greeks and Romans. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great was welcomed as a liberator in Persian-occupied Egypt. He founded Alexandria in Egypt, which would become the prosperous capital of the Ptolemaic dynasty after his death. Following the conquest of North Africa's Mediterranean coastline by the Roman Empire, the area was integrated economically and culturally into the Roman system. Roman settlement occurred in modern Tunisia and elsewhere along the coast. The first Roman emperor native to North Africa was Septimius Severus. Born in Leptis Magna in present-day Libya, his mother was Italian-Roman and his father was Punic. Christianity spread across these areas at an early date, from Judea via Egypt and beyond the borders of the Roman world into Nubia. By AD 340 at the latest, it had become the state religion of the Aksumite Empire. Syro-Greek missionaries, who arrived by way of the Red Sea, were responsible for this theological development. In the early 7th century, the newly formed Arabian Islamic Caliphate expanded into Egypt, and then into North Africa. In a short while, the local Berber elite had been integrated into Muslim Arab tribes. When the Umayyad capital Damascus fell in the 8th century, the Islamic center of the Mediterranean shifted from Syria to Kairouan in North Africa. Islamic North Africa had become diverse, and a hub for mystics, scholars, jurists, and philosophers. During the above-mentioned period, Islam spread to sub-Saharan Africa, mainly through trade routes and migration. 9th to 18th centuries pre-colonial Africa possessed perhaps as many as 10,000 different states and polities characterized by many different sorts of political organization and rule. These included small family groups of hunter-gatherers such as the San people of southern Africa, larger, more structured groups such as the family clan groupings of the Bantu-speaking peoples of Central, Southern, and Eastern Africa, heavily structured clan groups in the Horn of Africa, the large Sahelian kingdoms, and autonomous city-states and kingdoms such as those of the Akan, Edo, Yoruba, and Igbo people in West Africa, and the Swahili coastal trading towns of Southeast Africa. By the 9th century AD, a string of dynastic states, including the earliest Hausa states, stretched across the sub-Saharan savanna from the western regions to central Sudan. The most powerful of these states were Ghana, Gao, and the Kanem-Bornu Empire. Ghana declined in the 11th century, but was succeeded by the Mali Empire, which consolidated much of western Sudan in the 13th century. Kanem accepted Islam in the 11th century. In the forested regions of the West African coast, independent kingdoms grew, with little influence from the Muslim north. The kingdom of Sinai was established around the 9th century and was one of the first. It is also one of the oldest kingdoms in present-day Nigeria and was ruled by the Sinai. The Sinai kingdom is famous for its elaborate bronzes found at the town of Igbo, UKW. The bronzes have been dated from as far back as the 9th century. The kingdom of Ife, historically the first of these Yoruba Yoruba city-states or kingdoms, established government under a priestly Oba, called the Uni of Ife. Ife was noted as a major religious and cultural center in West Africa, and for its unique naturalistic tradition of bronze sculpture. The Ife model of government was adapted at the Oyo Empire, where its Obiese kings, called the Alaafins of Oyo, once controlled a large number of other Yoruba and non-Yoruba city-states and kingdoms. The Fon Kingdom of Dahomey was one of the non-Yoruba domains under Oyo control. The Almoravids were a Berber dynasty from the Sahara that spread over a wide area of northwestern Africa and the Iberian Peninsula during the 11th century. The Banu Hilal and Banu Makil were a collection of Arab Bedouin tribes from the Arabian Peninsula who migrated westwards for Egypt between the 11th and 13th centuries. The migration resulted in the fusion of the Arabs and Berbers, where the locals were Arabized, and Arab culture absorbed elements of the local culture under the unifying framework of Islam. Following the breakup of Mali, a local leader named Sani Ali founded the Songhai Empire in the region of Middle Niger and the Western Sudan and took control of the trans-Saharan trade. Sani Ali seized Timbuktu in 1468 and Jen in 1473, building his regime on trade revenues and the cooperation of Muslim merchants. His successor Askia Muhammad I made Islam the official religion, built mosques, and brought to Gao Muslim scholars, including al-Mafdali, the founder of an important tradition of Sudanic African Muslim scholarship. By the 11th century, some Hausa states, such as Kano, Jigawa, Katsina, and Gobir, had developed into walled towns engaging in trade, servicing caravans, and the manufacture of goods. Until the 15th century, these small states were on the periphery of the major Sudanic empires of the era, paying tribute to Songhai to the west and Kanem-Borno to the east. Height of slave trade. Slavery had long been practiced in Africa. Between the 7th and 20th centuries, Arab slave trade took 18 million slaves from Africa via trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean routes. Between the 15th and the 19th centuries, the Atlantic slave trade took an estimated 7 to 12 million slaves to the New World. More than 1 million Europeans were captured by Barbary pirates and sold as slaves in North Africa between the 16th and 19th centuries. In West Africa, the decline of the Atlantic slave trade in the 1820s caused dramatic economic shifts in local polities. The gradual decline of slave trading, prompted by a lack of demand for slaves in the New World, increasing anti-slavery legislation in Europe and America, and the British Royal Navy's increasing presence off the West African coast, obliged African states to adopt new economies. Between 1808 and 1860, the British West Africa Squadron seized approximately 1,600 slave ships and freed 150,000 Africans who were aboard. Action was also taken against African leaders who refused to agree to British treaties to outlaw the trade. For example, against the usurping King of Lagos, deposed in 1851. Anti-slavery treaties were signed with over 50 African rulers. The largest powers of West Africa adopted different ways of adapting to the shift. Asante and Dahomey concentrated on the development of legitimate commerce in the form of palm oil, cocoa, timber and gold, forming the bedrock of West Africa's modern export trade. The Oyo Empire, unable to adapt, collapsed into civil wars, colonialism and the scramble for Africa. In the late 19th century, the European imperial powers engaged in a major territorial scramble and occupied most of the continent, creating many colonial territories, and leaving only two fully independent states, Ethiopia and Liberia. Egypt and Sudan were never formally incorporated into any European colonial empire. However, after the British occupation of 1882, Egypt was effectively under British administration until 1922. Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference, held in 1884–85, was an important event in the political future of African ethnic groups. It was convened by King Leopold II of Belgium, and attended by the European powers that laid claim to African territories. It sought to end the European powers' scramble for Africa by agreeing on political division and spheres of influence. They set up the political divisions of the continent by spheres of interest that exist in Africa today. Independence struggles. Imperial rule by Europeans would continue until after the conclusion of World War II, when almost all remaining colonial territories gradually obtained formal independence. Independence movements in Africa gained momentum following World War II, which left the major European powers weakened. In 1951, Libya, a former Italian colony, gained independence. In 1956, Tunisia and Morocco won their independence from France. Ghana followed suit the next year, becoming the first of the sub-Saharan colonies to be granted independence. Most of the rest of the continent became independent over the next decade. Portugal's overseas presence in sub-Saharan Africa lasted from the 16th century to 1975. After the Estado Novo regime was overthrown in a military coup in Lisbon, Rhodesia unilaterally declared independence from the United Kingdom in 1965 under the white minority government of Ian Smith, but was not internationally recognized as an independent state until 1980, when black nationalists gained power after a bitter guerrilla war. Although South Africa was one of the first African countries to gain independence, the state remained under the control of the country's white minority through a system of racial segregation known as apartheid until 1994. Post-colonial Africa. Today, Africa contains 54 sovereign countries, most of which have borders that were drawn during the era of European colonialism. Since colonialism, African states have frequently been hampered by instability, corruption, violence, and authoritarianism. The vast majority of African states are republics that operate under some form of the presidential system of rule. However, few of them have been able to sustain democratic governments on a permanent basis, and many have instead cycled through a series of coups, producing military dictatorships. Great instability was mainly the result of marginalization of ethnic groups, and graft under these leaders, for political gain. Many leaders found ethnic conflicts, some of which had been exacerbated, or even created, by colonial rule. In many countries, the military was perceived as being the only group that could effectively maintain order, and it ruled many nations in Africa during the 1970s and early 1980s. During the period from the early 1960s to the late 1980s, Africa had more than 70 coups and 13 presidential assassinations. Border and territorial disputes were also common, with the European-imposed borders of many nations being widely contested through armed conflicts. Cold War conflicts between the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as the policies of the International Monetary Monetary Fund, also played a role in instability. When a country became independent for the first time, it was often expected to align with one of the two superpowers. Many countries in northern Africa received Soviet military aid, while others in Central and Southern Africa were supported by the United States, France. Both. The 1970s saw an escalation of Cold War intrigues, as newly independent Angola and Mozambique aligned themselves with the Soviet Union, and the West and South Africa sought to contain Soviet influence by supporting friendly regimes or insurgency movements. In Rhodesia, Soviet and Chinese-backed leftist guerrillas of the Zimbabwe Patriotic Front waged a brutal guerrilla war against the country's white government. There was a major famine in Ethiopia, when hundreds of thousands of people starved. Some claimed that Marxist economic policies made the situation worse. The most devastating military conflict in modern independent Africa has been the Second Congo War. This conflict and its aftermath has killed an estimated 5.5 million people. Since 2003 there has been an ongoing conflict in Darfur which has become a humanitarian disaster. Another notable tragic event is the 1994 Rwandan genocide, in which an estimated 800,000 people were murdered. AIDS in post-colonial Africa has also been a prevalent issue. In the 21st century, however, the number of armed conflicts in Africa has steadily declined. For instance, the civil war in Angola came to an end in 2002 after nearly 30 years. This has coincided with many countries abandoning communist-style command economies and opening up for market reforms. The improved stability and economic reforms have led to a great increase in foreign investment into many African nations, mainly from China, which has spurred quicker economic growth in many countries, seemingly ending decades of stagnation and decline. Several African economies are among the world's fastest growing as of 2016. A significant part of this growth, which is sometimes referred to as Africa Rising, can also be attributed to the facilitated diffusion of information technologies and specifically the mobile telephone. Geography. Africa is the largest of the three great southward projections from the largest land mass of the Earth. Separated from Europe by the Mediterranean Sea, it is joined to Asia at its northeast extremity by the Isthmus of Suez, 163 kilometers wide. For the most northerly point, Ras Ben Sakka in Tunisia, to the most southerly point, Cape Agulhas in South Africa, is a distance of approximately 8,000 kilometers. From Cape Verde, 17 degrees 33 minutes 22 seconds. W, the westernmost point, to Ras Hafun in Somalia, 51 degrees 27 minutes 52 seconds. E, the most easterly projection, is a distance of approximately 7,400 kilometers. The coastline is 26,000 kilometers long, and the absence of deep indentations of the shore is illustrated by the fact that Europe, which covers only 10,400,000 square kilometers, about a third of the surface of Africa, has a coastline of 32,000 kilometers. Africa's largest country is Algeria, and its smallest country is the Seychelles, an archipelago off the east coast. The smallest nation on the continental mainland is the Gambia. Geologically, Africa includes the Arabian Peninsula, the Zagros Mountains of Iran, and the Anatolian Plateau of Turkey, where the African plate collided with Eurasia. The Afrotropic ecozone and the Sahara-Arabian Desert to its north unite the region biogeographically, and the Afro-Asiatic language family unites the north linguistically. Climate. The climate of Africa ranges from tropical to subarctic on its highest peaks. Its northern half is primarily desert or arid, while its central and southern areas contain both savanna plains and dense jungle regions. In between, there is a convergence where vegetation patterns such as Sahel and steppe dominate. Africa is the hottest continent on Earth, and 60% of the entire land surface consists of drylands and deserts. The record for the highest ever recorded temperature in Libya in 1922 was discredited in 2013. Fauna Africa boasts perhaps the world's largest combination of density and range of freedom of wild animal populations and diversity, with wild populations of large carnivores and herbivores ranging freely on primarily open non-private plains. It is also home to a variety of jungle animals including snakes and primates, and aquatic life such as crocodiles and amphibians. In addition, Africa has the largest number of megafauna species, as it was least affected by the extinction of the Pleistocene megafauna. Ecology and biodiversity deforestation is affecting Africa at twice the world rate, according to the United Nations Environment Programme. According to the University of Pennsylvania African Studies Center, 31% of Africa's pasture lands and 19% of its forests and woodlands are classified as degraded, and Africa is losing over 4 million hectares of forest per year, which is twice the average deforestation rate for the rest of the world. Some sources claim that approximately 90% of the original virgin forests in West Africa have been destroyed. Over 90% of Madagascar's original forests have been destroyed since the arrival of humans 2,000 years ago. About 65% of Africa's agricultural land suffers from soil degradation. Africa has over 3,000 protected areas, with 198 marine protected areas, 50 biosphere reserves, and 80 wetlands reserves. Significant habitat destruction, increases in human population and poaching are reducing Africa's biological diversity. Human encroachment, civil unrest, and the introduction of non-native species threaten biodiversity in Africa. This has been exacerbated by administrative problems, inadequate personnel and funding problems.